Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Newsam's Night TV studio and another edition of Inside Media. I'm your host, John Maynard. In just over 2 weeks, President Barack Obama will either be elected to his second term or become the first one-term president since George Bush Sr. And judging by the recent polls, it's certainly too close to call at this point. But regardless of next month's outcome, there's no denying that Barack Obama's path to the presidency was a unique and incredible journey. Here to talk about that journey is one of the nation's most acclaimed biographers, David Maraniss. David is the author of the new book, which made some major headlines this summer, Barack Obama, The Story. This book really beautifully provides a multi-generational portrait of Obama and his American and Kenyan families. David is an associate editor at the Washington Post and is the author of best-selling books on Bill Clinton, Vince Lombardi, Roberto Clemente, Vietnam, the 60s, and the 1960 Rome Olympics. David won the Pulitzer Prize in 1993 for his coverage of Bill Clinton, and again in 2007 as part of the Washington Post team for coverage of the Virginia Tech shooting tragedy. David's also been a Pulitzer finalist 3 other times. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Maraniss.
Thank you.
So David, before we get to the book, we've got to talk a little politics. You've been writing quite a bit throughout the campaign for the Post. One more debate remains. Let's go to the debates. What happened with Obama in the first debate, and did he stem the tide at Hofstra University?
You know, I think the first 2 debates were, based on my study of his life, fairly predictable. His difficulties with the first debate are only partly explained by circumstances other than his own personality. That would be that his campaign was already sort of playing defense. They weren't, they just didn't want to make any mistakes at that point, and that was the mentality of the campaign in many different ways. And he probably went into that debate with that mentality as well. But then there were other characteristics particular to Barack Obama that made that a little more difficult. One was his natural inclination not to be confrontational, which you'll see from the book goes all the way back through his history, partly as a biracial kid learning to negotiate different cultures, partly the Hawaii influence of just be cool, don't confront, just many different ways that throughout his life he's not directly confrontational. Secondly, unlike so many politicians, and especially another politician, I wrote a book about Bill Clinton, Barack Obama has a certain ambivalence about politics. You know, he's said publicly, you know, he disdains the soundbite mentality or the 24-hour news cycle. He's more of a participant observer in his own actions and sort of looking at some of the surreal aspects of what he's expected to do as a politician. None of that played well in that first debate with Mitt Romney. But he's also incredibly competitive. And so after the first debate, which did not surprise me, I thought he would do much better in the second debate, which by most standards he did. So the third debate is the big question.
Yeah. Any predictions or anything we can expect to see?
Well, I don't. You know, I know what you'll expect to see, which is a major debate over the Libya discussion, which sort of took place in the second debate, much to Mitt Romney's, displeasure in terms of how it ended up. But he walked right into it. Right. So both of them will be much better prepared on that issue this time. I think that President Obama and his administration have been somewhat confusing in trying to explain what happened, but it was a very confusing event, you know, and even the New York Times and the Washington Post in their recreations of it over the last 2 weeks, or attempts to, have presented somewhat contradictory information about it, as has the Obama administration. But I think he understands that he has to present the clearest explanation yet of that, and Mitt Romney will go back at it again, because that is the one strongest area of vulnerability for the Obama administration in their foreign policy, which in most other respects, you know, whether it was finding bin Laden or what they've done in getting out of Iraq and Afghanistan, it's harder to find the points to attack Obama, so that's where they'll go.
Well, let's get to the book itself. You wrote several long profiles of then candidate Obama during the 2008 campaign. When did you decide that you wanted to write a book about him?
You know, there was an assumption that I would write this book because I'd written a lot about Bill Clinton in '92 for the Post, and went and took that and wrote my first, actually that was my first book, first in its class.
First in its class.
So, and every 4 years for the Washington Post, my basic assignment, or what I choose to do, is to write major profiles of presidential candidates.
Right.
So my friends and colleagues and people were assuming I would do the Obama book, and it actually was one of the hardest decisions I've had to make. And it really didn't have to do with Barack Obama. It had to do with the modern American political climate or culture, which I think is toxic. And it had become increasingly toxic since I'd written about Bill Clinton. And so I wasn't particularly eager to throw myself back into that, knowing that I would try to do a serious, historical, fact-based biography that would probably come out some point during a political campaign and could be manipulated or used in a lot of different ways that are not what I consider to be serious historical use of a book. So I wasn't sure I wanted to do that. But in the end, actually on election night, I decided that the story was too great, and I had two obsessions that drove me. For every book I do, I have to have something that really obsesses me. And with this book, the first part was the complete randomness of Barack Obama's existence. I mean, everybody, all of us are random creatures. His story is more unlikely than most. And that really fascinated me. And I saw it as an opportunity to write about the entire modern world through this one family's history.
Right.
The second obsession was, given the contradictions that he was born into, how did he figure himself out? Right. So what drove me into this book were the world that created Barack Obama, and then how he recreated himself.
Right. And this is not a traditional biography of presidents that you think of. You know, you trace his Kenyan roots, American roots in great detail before we even get to his birth.
You know, it's partly, I would say, I never intended it to be a biography in that sense, and so maybe it's a failure of explaining a book, but an author's responsibility in writing a book is to himself or herself in terms of the story you want to tell. And that's the story I wanted to tell, the world that created him and how he recreated himself. I intend to do a second volume, which will be his political life. But for someone who's written about politics for 35 years, I'm really not that interested in a lot of politics. I'm more interested in people and sociological forces and the forces that shape people and events. And that's what's driven me through my political books and my so-called sports books like Lombardi and Clemente. You know, I love sports. I've written about politics, but in each case, it's the people and the specific themes of the stories that drive me.
Your philosophy when writing this book and other books, and you've used this quote before, is go there, go there. In this case, you indeed went there, traveling to Africa, Indonesia, Hawaii. How does going there really help you in your work?
It is my mantra, and so that meant at one point turning to my wife and saying, how would you like to move to Green Bay for the winter to do the Lombardi book? And her response was brr, but we went up there and spent an entire winter living in Green Bay, and it was only through that experience that I could really feel what it was like to live in a company town, which was Green Bay, the Packers, and also endure a Green Bay winter. So that in so many different ways that are evident both on the page and just in fusing the sensibility I have, I think going there is essential. So after going to Green Bay, of course, I've been making it up to my wife ever since. It was a lot easier to say, how would you like to go to San Juan for the winter to do Clemente, or to Rome to study the world at the time of the '60 Olympics.
A little easier pill to swallow.
But this book took us incredible places. You know, I traveled 60,000 miles or more to Hawaii several times, to Kenya and Indonesia, and then the arc of Obama's own life, from Hawaii to Los Angeles to New York to Chicago. And at each step along the way, I think it's really important, and what I try to do is not go as a tourist, and not go just on the spur of the moment, but spend months preparing and find the right people. What happened there?
Oh no, it's good. I think we got
Sorry, were you hearing me
amplified.
before?
Yeah. Good. Okay.
Finding the right people in each of the geographical places that are rooted there. They can help me get past the superficial and find the real story. And so I spend a lot of time preparing before I go.
Well, speaking of all the places you went, you know, Obama spent his childhood in Hawaii, Indonesia, college years at Occidental in Los Angeles,
Right.
Columbia in New York. So obviously all these stops in his life affected his eventual career path, but can you point to any one time that may have been more influential than another?
No.
Okay.
I think, I mean, I don't look at it that way. I think that each step along the way adds to the story and the overall shape of his life. But, and so much of it was shaped early, you know, by the fact that the coincidence of his parents meeting and then his father never living with a father. I mean, that obviously from the title of his memoir, Dreams from My Father, to so many other ways that I discovered that aren't in that book. Growing up without that father, it was an enormous influence. Growing up biracial in Hawaii, Hawaii is interesting to me because in one sense it was probably the best place in the United States for him to grow up because it is such a diverse polyglot community and full of what the native Hawaiians call hapa, which are half and half, you know, Japanese, Chinese, Portuguese, Okinawan, Haole, which is Anglo, native Hawaiian. And so many of them are a mixture of that. So many of the people there. One of his buddies in high school was named Tom Topolinski. He sounds Polish, he was Chinese. You know, it's that kind of place. And so Barry Obama, he was Barry as a kid. You know, in his memoir, he writes about how he thought his name was funny. It's not funny at all. When I was in Honolulu, there was an entire plane load of Japanese from the city of Obama in Japan coming to Honolulu to look at the places of their namesake, Barack Obama. Obama is a Japanese name, and it's very familiar there. So there was nothing odd really about any of that. But on the other hand, Hawaii is very few African Americans. And so the few that were there mostly related to the military bases. And he had, you know, from the day he was born, obviously he had to deal with the issues of race because of the color of his skin. But he had no cultural connections to African American life. His mother was white, his father was gone, his grandparents with whom he lived were white. There were very few African Americans around. So the second half of my book is really his search for racial identity. And Hawaii was the beginning of that, but it couldn't satisfy it for him.
I mentioned in the opening that the book did make some pretty big headlines this summer, one of them being that you do point out some inconsistencies with his memoir, Dreams from My Father. But you've said it's not a gotcha book.
No.
But there were a fair number of inconsistencies. What were some of the more notable ones?
You know, in President Obama's memoir, in the introduction, he acknowledges that some of the characters in the book are composites, and some of the storyline is compressed chronology. So he acknowledges that. As a journalist trained in the ethics of the Washington Post, as a nonfiction narrative writer, I don't believe in that. I would never do it. I think it's unethical. But there's a difference between a memoir and a serious historical biography. And when he was writing the book, I got a hold of his first proposal, and the title was Journeys in Black and White. And he was really, the book's intent was to look at his life through the lens of race. So you know, it was one of the reasons that I described earlier about my reluctance to even do this book, is because I knew people would manipulate whatever I found. And my goal always is try to explain things and put them in context. So there are two different ways that Barack Obama writing this book and what I found doing the biography differed. Some of it was completely innocent mythology passed along by his family. Think about any of you in this audience the stories that your parents or uncles or grandparents told you about your family history, you know, they may or may not be true, but you don't have an historian coming back after it later to determine whether it is or not. Well, similarly, Barack Obama was passing along some family mythology. You know, some of the examples, the tragic one somehow makes me laugh anyway, but it was that his step-grandfather, his mother married twice, first to Barack Obama Sr. and then to an Indonesian, Lolo Sutoro. In President Obama's memoir and in the family lore, the grandfather on the Indonesian side was killed fighting the Dutch, died as a martyr during the revolution, the fight for independence in the late 1940s against the Dutch in Indonesia. And when I got to Indonesia, I discovered through documents that in fact that grandfather died falling off a stool in his living room, changing the drapes. Now that's a slightly different story.
Yeah. Just a little.
Similarly, on the Kenyan side, the story that Barack Obama writes about in his memoir, and that was told largely by a step-grandmother, Mama Sarah, who's a character in the memoir, was that his grandfather, Hussein Onyango, was imprisoned and tortured by the British. You know, one particular right-winger, Dinesh D'Souza, has grabbed upon that notion to make this whole thing about President Obama being anti-colonial and so on, and everything shaped by that. To which my first answer is, what's so great about colonialism? But secondly, it's not true. When I went to Kenya, I interviewed 6 people who knew the grandfather, Hussein Onyango, none of whom said this happened. There are no documents that prove it. I shouldn't say it's not true, because as an historian, I try to leave open the possibility of things. You should never close the door on it. I couldn't find any documents showing it. And I had interviewed a lot of people who said it didn't happen. So those are mythologies that in Obama's book that differ from mine. The other ones, like composite characters, you know, in his memoir, he writes about, there's a line in there that every journalist in the United States and around the world is fixated on. You know, I loved a woman in New York once. Right. She was white. So who was it? So everybody was trying to find her, and I did. Right. It took 3 years. She's an Australian woman who lived in New York then. And in his memoir, President Obama, because he's dealing with things through the lens of race, puts into his story with her several things that didn't happen with her. And it turns out when I finally found her and interviewed her, she was upset about that. He made her look sort of naive and not really understanding the subtleties of race in the United States, which was not true. So in several of those cases, his composite characters are a peculiar mix of people. Some of them white, some black. Well, there's one case where he gives a lot of characteristics to a black friend at Occidental, and most of that comes from a white girlfriend instead, or a white friend, not girlfriend. So he was doing that for a lot of reasons, but none of it was really venal. He was just trying to make some points about race. Right.
You did interview Obama specifically for the book. Was he a willing participant for this interview, or was he hesitant?
You know, it's all relative.
Okay.
When I was doing my book on President Clinton, during the campaign, I interviewed Bill Clinton 7 times. The moment I started doing the book, I say it was like Lucy in the football and the peanut strip character. Every time I was about to get an interview, George Stephanopoulos would call and say, yeah, he's just not ready for you. So it never happened for the book. Right. I knew that President Obama would interview with me, and I knew that I wanted it to be the last interview because I wanted to go in there knowing as much or more about his family story than he did. The more you know, the more someone will talk and is interested. In this case, I gave him the introduction to the book because I wanted him to know all the hard work I'd done going around the world and the many different places I'd gone, which is described in the introduction, and also some of my conclusions. It was my first real experience with Obama. I'd met him once briefly in 2004 in Boston, right before he gave the speech by which everybody got to know him. But in that case, I was with a friend who all he really wanted to know was whether Obama was a Cubs or a White Sox fan. And when he said White Sox, he passed the test. Okay. So anyway, but I've always known that Obama was a sports guy, a jock, and I was trying to figure out how to break the ice with him, and I realized that probably the best way was he's a Bears fan and I'm a Packers fan. I wrote about Lombardi. I grew up in Wisconsin. 2 years ago, the Packers played the Bears in the NFC Championship game to determine who would go to the Super Bowl. And President Obama, that right before the game said, if the Bears win, I'll go to the Super Bowl. So the Packers won. And Charles Woodson, a great Packer defensive back, got up in the dressing room after the game and said, President Obama won't come see us at the Super Bowl. We'll go see him at his house, which they did when they won the Super Bowl. So I walked into the Oval Office, and my first words were, President Obama, or Mr. President, Charles Woodson got here before me, but I'm glad we both finally made it. To which he responded, man, those Packers were rough on me. And I said, well, deservedly so, you're a Bears fan. Yeah. And he said, yeah, but every time I go to Wisconsin, they give me another share of Packer stock. It's a publicly owned team. The stock doesn't mean anything, but they give Obama, stock. Then when we sat down, he said, David, I've read your introduction. It's really interesting, but you call my book fiction. Mm. And I looked over at Jay Carney, his press secretary, because I know I did. And I said, actually, Mr. President, I complimented you. I called it literature. But the point was, and I want him to know that there are discrepancies and how I explained them. So we went through all of that. He wasn't really defensive. In most cases, he said, well, you're probably right. You did more research on this than I did. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of the composites, he explained why he did them. So it wasn't a hostile interview in that sense, but he was slightly defensive about some of it. And it was supposed to go for 45 minutes, and it went on for an hour and a half. Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, twice he left the room saying he had to go check on the Situation Room, which and then he'd come back and say everything's cool, and he talks some more. And, part of the reason it went on for so long is that he knew I knew a lot. He was probably curious where Genevieve, the girlfriend, was and how she was doing, and he wanted to get to that point. And, and so there are a lot of reasons. But generally speaking, as a journalist for more than 35 years, I know at every interview, the more I know, the more productive the interview will be.
We do want to get to your questions, so please, if you do have a question, please just raise your hand. And again, we have 2 staffers with microphones who will take those questions. We'll go right there. But before we go to your question, you did mention Bill Clinton earlier, and of course you wrote a brilliant biography of Mr. Clinton. Obviously very different people, Obama and Clinton, but yet they share one major thing, which is of course growing up without a father. Yeah. Tell us about their kind of parallel lives.
There's 2 riffs I do on that. One is they did both come out of provincial background, Southwest Arkansas and Hawaii. Couldn't be further from the centers of power. Both without fathers. Bill Clinton's father was killed before he was born. And Barack Obama never knew his father. Some other dysfunctions in the family settings of alcoholism they had to deal with. They deal with it in completely different ways. Bill Clinton, from early on, knew he wanted to be president of the United States. When he was, in high school, Hot Springs High School, he ran for president every year until when he was a senior, his principal, Johnny May Mackey, came to him and said, Billy, we're sick of you. You can't run for class president. So he said, okay, I'll run for class secretary instead. And he ran against his girlfriend who beat him, and he wouldn't talk to her for weeks. And then he came here to Georgetown and was president of President Obama, you see none of that. In high school, he basically played basketball and was part of a little gang of friends called the Chum Gang. And in Occidental and even in Columbia, he was very much removed from that. But Bill Clinton, his whole life, sort of had this notion of just move forward, plow on, whatever the trouble is, just go past it. And that capacity to wake up every day, forgive himself, forgive the world, move on, made him an incredible survivor. And that skill got him into the White House and got him in trouble in the White House because he hadn't resolved a lot of things, got him out of trouble in the White House because he's such a great survivor, got him into trouble, he's leaving the White House. I mean, it's just a constant cycle. And right now, he's the most popular politician in America. So watch out, something will probably happen, you know, but then he'll figure his way out of that. Barack Obama, from the age 18, when he left the island to go to Occidental, then to Columbia, and then 2 years in New York and Chicago, for 9 years, as a young adult, he really seriously, introspectively, in every possible way, racially, sociologically, politically, tried to figure himself out, work out the contradictions of his life. You can see it in the letters he wrote and the journals his girlfriends kept in every possible way. He wanted to figure all that out. And to the extent that a human being can do that, to become what you would call a quote-unquote integrated personality, he did. That gave him the confidence to go on into politics, got him to the White House, and then got him in trouble in the White House because he went in with this sort of sensibility that if I can figure out the contradictions in my life, why can't Congress? Why can't the rest of the world? He wasn't ready for the transactional nature and the polarization of politics in the country, and thought he could overcome it, which was somewhat naive. So they dealt with their lives completely differently. It both got them to incredible places, but you also see the patterns of both success and difficulty that arises from that.
Sir, in the fourth row.
One of the more controversial people in Barack Obama's life was Reverend Jeremiah Wright. I'm wondering if you interviewed him and if you reached any conclusions about how much role his acquaintance played in where he is today, or in the
Reverend
past.
Wright, Jeremiah Wright, will be in my second volume. This book ends, you're introduced to Wright, because during Barack Obama's first 3 years in Chicago as a community organizer, he was organizing on the South Side, 98% black, and the key to organizing were black preachers. So every Sunday for a few years, Barack Obama would go to a different church, and it was really like his graduate school. That's where he learned oratory. I mean, the skills you see of him speaking today came from the black churches of Chicago. He wasn't inherently a good speaker. But also politics, sociology, everything he learned in those black churches. Eventually, his first mentor or friend among the black preachers was Alvin Love of the Lilydale Baptist Church. Love was closer to Obama's age. They both felt like a little bit of outsiders. And Love said to him, you know, Barack, you're using these churches. You can't just use them. You have to become part of them. And so there's a long, slow progression you see of Obama first deciding to join a church. And the advice was, don't join a church within the jurisdiction of where you're organizing, because then all of the other ministers will be envious and upset. So you have to go outside that area. So Reverend Wright's church was just outside of that organizing area. His church during that period was the place to go for young black professionals in Chicago of every political stripe. They all went to, many of them went to Reverend Wright's church. You know, I mean, Obama was married by Reverend Wright. He was there for 20-some years. Of all the people I've interviewed that say, you know, there's no denying that some of Wright's sermons were fiery and over the top. You could go there 50 times a year and not see any of that. And twice a year you would hear it. So I don't think that Wright was Obama's mentor, but he certainly was an influence for him over those 20 years. And I think that because of the fiery nature of a couple of those sermons, it's become enhanced and exaggerated beyond what the real context should be.
Sir.
My question is somewhat related. Since there are so many Sunday morning Christians running around the political system in this country, how religious is Barack Obama? Is he deep commitment to a faith, or is it just nominal?
You know, in some ways that question is like saying, what's a marriage like? I mean, it's really presumptuous for someone else to say what's deep inside another human soul. So I don't know that. I mean, I do know the history and the context of it. His mother was a humanist who taught him to sort of admire all faiths. His grandparents were Methodist, Baptist, and then Unitarian. His father, the Kenyan, was not a Muslim, he was an atheist. And Barack Obama's progression into the Christian faith was slow. You know, first it was pragmatic. This is where he was organizing. He dealt with these ministers. Then it became somewhat political. You know, you had to join a church. And then he realized, and love kept pounding away at him, you know, it's not one thing to belong to a church, but do you really believe? Find your way. And President Obama maintains that he did find his way to a belief. Some of it is rooted in African American spirituality, and which is different. No, you know, I'm not judging it in any way, but it's a different way of looking at religion, metaphorically, somewhat than literally. You know, in Washington, he's not going to church very often, but neither did Ronald Reagan. You know, I mean, so you're right about everybody feels they have to profess this certain way, whether they really believe it. I honestly don't know. I know what I've read that he's written about his faith. I haven't interviewed him about it yet. I would feel somewhat presumptuous judging it. So that's one of those things where I think it's smartest to take it at face value, unless you see an obvious hypocrisy.
We have a question right there, sir.
Based on what you have learned as you wrote this book, win or lose next month, what do you think the president will do next in his life? What would you expect that to be?
Yeah, that's fascinating to think about. Whenever it happens, he'll be a young man when he's, you know, whether he has 2 terms or 1. With Bill Clinton, my answer was always, he'll keep running for president for the rest of his life, which in a sense he does, it has. And I also said that Bill Clinton would try to out-Carter Jimmy Carter in terms of his international, and he's done that. And I don't quite see either of those things with President Obama. I think his first sensibility is as a writer. So I'm very sure that he'll write some books. I hope they're books more like his first book than his second book. Audacity of Hope was more of a political tract, and to me not very interesting. And his first book, for whatever problems I had with some of the factuality of it, I thought was a fascinating and well-written account for the most part. And so I think he will write. I think that he will probably teach. He was, by all accounts, a very good instructor, professor at the University of Chicago Law School, where many of his more conservative students sing his praises. He was not a, you know, an ideological pedagogue. He really enjoyed that. So I think writing and teaching are 2 most likely, plus some, you know, they all have foundations. I mean, that's just a given. You know, I don't know what his will do, but it will focus on something that he cares most about, and probably be more rooted in the United States than in the world, I would guess.
We have just a few more minutes, so if we have a question in the front row? Yeah, go ahead. She's going to give you a mic so we can hear it. This is actually for, we record this program, so you can hear it on the recording.
I think so. Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. So first off, I'm here with my sister, and my father has Green Bay season tickets.
Oh,
but,
all right.
So I understand that Obama does have a sister, and what is the
yes.
What's the story there?
Yeah. Well, he has more than one sister, but he's closest. He has an African sister, Alma, and then his sister Maya, who is. They have the same mother. He's closest to Maya, who is the daughter of Stanley Ann Dunham, Barack Obama's mother, and the Indonesian father. And Maya was born in Indonesia when Barry was a boy in there, and so they grew up together more than any of the African relatives. Maya is a wonderful, interesting person with some of his characteristics, but not his political desires. Or she's a teacher. She's sort of spreading the global nature of the Obama family. She married a Chinese Canadian, you know, so their kid is what, you know? I mean, it's incredible. She's lived in Honolulu most of her life, and so I spent a lot of time with her there. You know, they both lost their mother at a very early age. She died when she was 52. So.
We're going to have to wrap up in just a moment. I have a question. I should have followed up as a former journalist. You said the former girlfriend of Barack Obama, no one could find her. How did you find her? What's your secret?
3 years of hard work.
Okay.
First we had nothing, not even a name. Just someone had said that he thought that this girlfriend in New York had sort of an interesting accent that might have been Australian. Then after a year, a friend recalled that on the back of an envelope sent by another friend, it said, by the way, P.S. Barry broke up with Genevieve. So we had a first name. And then for a year, did every permutation possible of Genevieve, New York, Australia, 1980s, into every computer thing we could find. Eventually hit on one New York Times wedding announcement that rang every bell for me. Genevieve Cook, getting married in Northwest Connecticut, and in his memoir, Obama writes about them going up to some posh part of New England. The parents were Australian, but lived in Indonesia for a long time. So everything just sort of rang bells. And then I went through court records in Northwest Connecticut and found that she'd been divorced from that wedding and had a third name. We went finding every telephone number for that name and got one. And I'd just come back from Indonesia. I had jet lag, and at 2 in the morning, I placed a call. And this woman answered, and I said who I was, and she said, how did you ever find me? And as I've said before, you know, as a journalist, you can tell in 5, or even anybody, when you're dealing with another human being, you can tell pretty quickly whether chemically it's connecting or not. And I could tell immediately. And so we talked for hours that night, and then every day for many, many weeks.
Incredible, incredible. You will be writing a second book on the president,
I'm going to do
Win or Lose.
I'm going to do another book in between.
You are. That's what I was going to ask you. Can you give us any hints?
I haven't said it publicly or described. I can't describe it in 30 seconds yet, but it's Detroit in 1963. It's Motown and automobiles and Martin Luther King, who came there and gave his I Have a Dream speech 2 months before he did it here. He did it in Detroit. He was introduced by Aretha Franklin's father. Walter Reuther, the head of the UAW, was walking arm in arm with him. So I'm going to write about an American city where I was born. I was born in Detroit, left when I was 6, but it's still somewhere deep inside me. The American city, everybody knows about its decomposition. I regret all of that, but I want to write about it at its high point. So that's what it is. Detroit, 1963.
Excellent. We look forward to that also. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank you, David Maraniss, for his great performance. And the book, Barack Obama, the story, again, we're selling copies right outside the studio, and David will be signing copies. So thank you for joining us here today. Great.
All right.
Welcome.